Hi, I'm Amy O'Regan from Awesome Training, and today I'm speaking with Chen Gershuni. Can you tell us a little bit about what we can expect from your talk on the 15th about neurodiversity?
So I'll be on the panel discussion about neurodiversity. I think I'll talk about the different aspects of neurodiversity, because the way I see neurodiversity is actually three different things. Because on the one hand, it's the diversity of human neurology, and this is a scientific fact. I mean, you cannot debate the diversity of human neurology. It just exists. Anyone knows that it exists. But the other aspect of neurodiversity is more of an ideology, the ideology of neurological minorities that should have a better place in society, should be understood better, tolerated better, accommodated. And this is something that's still really in its infancy, because the whole notion of neurodiversity is quite new. Most people still don't know much about it, and definitely don't know how to treat neurological minorities, how to respect neurological minorities, and also how to gain positive things from what neurological minorities have to contribute to wider society. And the third aspect of neurodiversity is the neurodiversity movement. It's the movement that many of us are building for the past, 20 years, even more, and trying to advance the ideology of neurodiversity, that it would be accepted in wider society. Also, I know they would want to hear about what I think people get wrong about neurodiversity, because there's a lot of criticism about the movement, a lot of misunderstanding. We are often criticized by parents of autistic children who may have more severe limitations, and they think that all of the proponents of neurodiversity only care for ourselves, like we're saying, oh, autism is fine, blah, blah, but they have children with much greater needs. But the reality of the neurodiversity movement is that we would like to advance the rights of everybody and the accommodations for everybody. And it's obvious that some people need much more support than others, but actually the movement very much supports the need for support. Another criticism that we get is that we oppose all treatments for neurological minorities, and it's also not true. It depends what the person themselves want, and it depends whether the person can make an informed decision. Because usually in the movement you hear from autistics who wouldn't want to be anything else. And I very much accept this myself, but I heard from autistic teenagers who very much want to be more neurotypicals. But from my point of view, it depends why they want it. I mean, if they really have all the options and they still should, and if they're accommodated as autistic teenagers and they still want to be more neurotypical, it's their right. I mean, I'm not opposing this, but I think the thing is, because society mistreats autistic people and other neurological minorities, it gives young autistic people maybe the motivation to change, because they feel that they're not good enough as they are. But if they would be better accommodated, then I hope they will accept themselves more, and then they wouldn't really want to be anything else. Also, I know they want to talk about why we need the neurodiversity movement. I think it's quite obvious, because all minorities need respect and understanding and support, and at the moment we don't have it. So obviously we need the movement to advance it and to build the infrastructure for support, for understanding. And also they would want to speak about the history of neurodiversity, probably the ideology and the movement. So I've been kind of following it since the late 1990s. So I know all of the organizations. I've been in touch with some of the people. I've attended autistic conferences which were organized by autistic people in England and in America since 2006. So I have a bit of a perspective to see how things change around the years. I think we're in a much better position nowadays because we're much larger and you see it more in newspapers a bit. I mean, back 15 years ago, it was really, really rare to see autism portrayed in at least a neutral way in the newspapers. And nowadays, I see more and more positive articles talking about accepting autism rather than eliminating autism. So I think we did advance quite a lot, but obviously we're still in the beginning. If I'm thinking where we want to be, there's still a lot to do. Also about how we can move forward from here, which is a good question. I would need to think about it. I mean, obviously, the more blogs, the more books, the more YouTube videos, the more conferences, it helps us network with each other, share ideas. And I think the more we share ideas with each other, and the more we also spread the ideas so people outside of the neurodiversity movement can hear them, hopefully we can continue onwards.
Could you tell me more about your work and your work in the autistic community, both in Israel and on a wider scale as well?
So I discovered I'm autistic back in the late 1990s. I was 20-something, near 30. And from the moment I discovered I'm on the autism spectrum, I thought about the idea of an autistic community. I didn't even know if there was an autistic community, but I think one of the first things I did was to go online, start searching whether there was an autistic community, because I thought it would be a good idea. And in the beginning, it was tiny. I remember finding one blog post by Martijn Dekker, who was one of the first activists in the community. He started a mailing list for autistic people back in 1996. It was called Independent Living on the Autism Spectrum. I never actually managed to get on the mailing list, but I read an article he wrote about the emergence of an autistic culture. And I said, wow, there is an emerging autistic culture. I should check more of that. But there wasn't really much. I mean, I saw that article, but I didn't see much more. About a year or two later, I discovered Autism Network International. They were also an autistic community who started in the early 90s, and they were holding an annual retreat called OTREAT, which was organized by autistics. And it was starting to seem interesting, and then I found Asking for Freedom. But then, I mean, since the late 90s till around 2005, I was just reading. I mean, because it was so tiny, I wasn't sure who to approach, how to fit in with this. And late 2005, I found on some Israeli website, some Israeli autistic woman who already started the community in Israel. Like, she started it in 2003. I found it in 2005. And then I joined it. And from the moment I joined it, I started advertising it. I started mostly translating things into Hebrew, because we had basically nothing in Israel. And I was wondering how to get people to even know what autism was the way we experienced it, because the media back then was still portraying a very very extreme image. And I was thinking about how we could portray a much more diverse image. So I started just translating whatever I found in the English media, whatever seemed to bring a more diverse image, a more realistic image, and I put everything in a blog. Just the blog grew and grew, and gradually people started commenting, and more people started finding our community, more and more autistic people. And to this day, I'm still doing it. I'm still translating, building my blog. And now that it's much larger, because now when I put something on Facebook in Hebrew, I can even get dozens of comments in a day. But it took many, many years to get this awareness, to get these reactions. Around that time, 2006, I started attending Otscape in England every summer, just to get to know more and more. And around that time, I published a series of articles in an Israeli, quite a national newspaper, the website of a newspaper, like a diary about my life. And I immediately received horrible talkbacks, all those mothers who say, "Oh, you're nothing like my child doesn't speak, blah, blah." And it's a bit difficult because you're telling about difficult things that you have. You're like exposing yourself and being very honest about your difficulties, and then you hope for some sympathy, and you get a lot of anger in return. I somehow got used to it. I managed to accept it, and I continued publishing it for as long as I was given the opportunity. And then I met someone who wanted to make a documentary film about the autistic community in Israel. So I kind of helped to produce it, to get all the people together, to think where to film, when. I also participated in it. And we also went to film in Otscape in 2013. And then it was, eventually the film was here in a documentary film festival in Tel Aviv, and also on a cable TV documentary channel. It was broadcast for quite a long time, like on repeat broadcasts. And I don't know, people told me that it had a lot of impact. I actually didn't receive any feedbacks myself, just heard from other people who were involved in the film that it did make an impact. Last year I wrote a fictional script about an autistic girl in high school and about her life and how she discovered she's autistic. But I don't know, at the moment it's unfinished, and I don't know what will become of it. Also, a friend of mine in the community here did a master's degree about autism, and she needed an autistic team, like to be a steering committee of autistic people for that. So I was at the steering committee, and then back at Otscape 2018, they had small lightning talks. Everybody talked a bit about what they're doing. So I talked a bit about that, and then I was invited to do a whole lecture about this in Poland in 2019. There's a really nice autistic community in Poland. They have an annual conference organized by autistic people, but it's very much for the general public. In a way, it's perhaps a bit like Awesome Core, because Awesome Ireland, it's also mostly by autistics, but for the general public. So it was a very nice experience going there, talking about her research. Now, the same friend of mine is doing a PhD about autism, about the sociology of autism. So I'm on the steering committee for this research as well. Her master's research was about how autistics experience their struggle with the establishment, because there's obviously a conflict between the autistic community and the establishment. So we interviewed about 20 or 30 autistic people about how they experience the conflict. And nowadays, the current research is basically about autistic socialization throughout their life, how autistics experience their communication with the society around them.
And could you tell us a little bit more about your personal journey and diagnosis? Did it help you in any way?
That's interesting. So I was born in 1970, and I think in the 1970s, throughout the world, there wasn't much awareness. Only there was awareness of severe autism. I mean, I was aware of it, but really the spectrum wasn't known. I think even the concept of the autism spectrum, it started in the late 80s to be talked about. So but I felt very different from other children from the time I was 3 years old, I think. It was always in my head. I was always wondering about it, always thinking about it, like year after year after year. And then when I was much older, like 17, 18, I started just reading about psychology. I became quite obsessed with psychology just to understand myself better. And I just read more and more about psychology for a few years. And then Donna Williams published her first autobiography, Nobody Nowhere, the autobiography of an autistic girl. And it was a very famous book around that time in the early 90s, because up until then, almost everybody believed that an autistic person wouldn't write an autobiography. It was like a paradox, because if the person is autistic, they would never be able to express themselves so well to be able to write it. And I believe so myself. I thought so. So I was fascinated by it. So I knew I had to read it. And then when I read it, it was like, so much of what she was describing, she was describing me on many levels, even though she has a very different story, and she also had a lot of things other than autism, but she kind of, she put a list of autistic symptoms, I think, at the end, autistic characteristics, a very long one, like 20 characteristics, and I fit practically, I don't remember all of them, but the vast majority, and this was like the big revelation. And I think from that big revelation came the big change, but it's still, like the big revelation was in 97 when I read it, but it still took a whole decade to really start being active in the autistic community, because in the late 90s, even though I already read a few autistic bloggers online, it was tiny, and I didn't know how do I fit into it. In the beginning, I was unhappy about discovering. I mean, it was a revelation. Oh, now I have the answer. But then when I went online to read about autism in general, it was like all gloom and doom, totally. So I have this big revelation. But then what? Then I said, okay, I'm approaching 30, and now I'll probably live the next few decades of my life until the end of my life pretty much isolated and alone and miserable, because that's what all of the articles were describing. And that was why it was so important for me to find the community. And from year to year, I became more happy about the community because it's growing from year to year. And another thing that I didn't say about the last few years, since I was 15 or so, I've been playing guitar and listening to music, and it was like my private autistic world that I could escape into. And in the past year or so, I've been playing here with a band of autistic musicians. All of us are on the autism spectrum, and all of the others are quite serious musicians. I'm not sure about myself, but they tolerate me, so it's great. And we're making music together, and I think that is really good basically for people from the autistic community to work on projects that are not, specifically about autism, just autistic professionals who are doing together something they're passionate about doing and about contributing to society as an autistic team, but projects that just contribute to society could be on any subject, anything. So I'm happy about that.